Hello, everyone. My name is Martin Belchev, and I'm the Associate Practice Leader for Europe. Here in FrontierView, we recently published our Global Events to Watch for 2023 that describes disruptive events that might have a significant impact on multinationals over the next year. Today, I have my colleague Mark McNamee, who's also the Director for Europe, to run us through some of these specific events, especially when it comes to the CIS region. Now, as a reminder, these events are significant in terms of their likelihood, hence they have higher than 10% likelihood of occurring, and are important enough for us to think that they're something that executives should keep on their radar, and in some cases plan introduce contingency plannings to mitigate against the disruptive effect that these events might have. It's also a good reminder that typically we see at least one or two of these events per region playing out every year. So these events are not hypotheticals. They're something that can occur and can have, again, substantial impact on businesses. Now, before I pass it over to Mark, I just want to run you through the content of the chart. So on the x-axis, we have the likelihood of the event occurring. On the y-axis, we have the velocity of the event, meaning how much and how quickly will the event impact the business. And the size of the bubble is the relative scale of the business impact of this event on multinationals.
Okay, great. Thank you for that intro there, Martin. So to begin with, I will just sort of focus on, at the outset, before getting into the actual events themselves, to note a couple of quick things, sort of the good news first, and then the negative news. So the good news is that for the most part, most of these events, right, are, first of all, outside of the base case scenario, and then within the downside, they are still quite relatively unlikely. So most of these events at 20% or less likely, 25% even and less likely, which is relatively positive, right? Now, unfortunately for the bad news, a couple of things. One is that for those of you who have been managing CIS markets and working with us for years, you will note that this coming year, there are far more risks than we've really ever had in the last 5, 7, 9 years in recent memory. So there are many more risks to be managing, and then also concerning is that there will be very little warning of many of these risks. As you can see in terms of velocity, a lot of these things could happen without much warning, without much preparation for businesses, and so it could be somewhat blindsiding you in your business for next year. So important to sort of go through each one here. We'll go through very briefly. Of course, if you'd like more information on any one of these or an overview of your CIS markets under your portfolio for this coming year, please do reach out to us, of course, for more depth. I will start on the right-hand side here, working in terms of likelihood, the most likely of these events to watch, of these downside, or in this case, upside scenario with Ukraine winning, and then we'll move sort of right to left. So at 30% likelihood, Ukraine winning the war, Russia pulling out. Very brief description. This effectively would see the Ukrainian army continue the very strong, consistent advances that they've been making since the end of August this year, where they truly shifted the strategic balance of the war. This is outside of our base case expectation, where we would see another stalemate arising in the coming months on the battlefield in Ukraine. And instead, in this scenario, we'd see actually Ukraine successfully pushing Russian soldiers out of its territory, and Russia effectively conceding and then pulling out their soldiers and ending the war. Obviously, a very positive scenario at a humanitarian level to end the fighting, naturally, but then also very positive in the case of Ukraine, where reinvestment could begin to occur and demand could pick up dramatically, currency improvements, financial investment improvements, etc. And then likewise, potentially for Russia as well, as you could see some sanctions relieved depending upon future policy orientation of the Kremlin and future leaders in the case that, for example, Putin were to be deposed, which is very likely under this particular scenario. Moving to the 25% likelihood events here, so starting with Kazakhstan oil exports stopped by Russia. This is unfortunately one of the most worrisome risks. Again, outside of our base case expectation, but still one of the most worrisome risks when you're looking at your CIS portfolio for 2023. Kazakhstan exports about 80% of its oil And oil, by the way, is about 25% of Kazakhstan's GDP. Oil is also about 50%, 50 to 60% of government revenues. So absolutely critical to the economic vitality of the nation. And Russia has already this year 4 times interrupted Kazakhstan's output and export of its oil, as 80% again of Kazakhstan's energy, of its oil specifically, goes through Russian territory and then is exported out of the Russian port of Novorossiysk. So this is, of course, quite dangerous for demand in general, but also for the tenge in particular. In addition, pre-existing conflicts ignite. Again, 25% likelihood. The issue with this and why this is such a, unfortunately, relatively high risk is related to the fact that in light of Russia's war in Ukraine, Russia has now been removed as the primary guarantor of security in the CIS region, a role that they had been playing, of course, for at least the last century. With Moscow out of the region, their security, their diplomatic, their political influence waning, this is now leaving the region much more to its own devices. Hence, we've seen, on the one hand, considerable pickup in fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh the last couple of years, which ironically may in fact lead to greater peace in the coming year, potentially, because of Baku's overwhelming force and predominance of power in that conflict. But then we're also seeing issues on the Afghan border. We saw this year violence along the Afghan border with Turkmenistan, with Uzbekistan, with Tajikistan. And likewise, the sort of continual Kyrgyz-Tajik border conflict, which saw, of course, an uptick in violence this year, and of course could see a further uptick in violence next year. So again, 25% likelihood downside scenario for those conflicts to reignite. At 20%, Putin being pushed out of office, I would say that overwhelmingly this event would occur, overwhelmingly likely that this event would occur with the previous event of Ukraine winning the war, sort of initiating then Putin's eventual ouster. So you would likely have to see both of these events more or less taking place. Now, on the one hand, this is colored yellow because there are both positive and negatives involved. On the one hand, more positively is that, of course, with Putin pushed out of office, you could see some level of sanctions relief depending upon his successor and the foreign policy orientation of the Kremlin after Putin's ouster. But then also, unfortunately, on the negative side, this would threaten the viability of the Russian Federation, the Russian state as we currently know it, as you could see numerous defections, right, and divisions across the Russian Federation, particularly of non-ethnic Russian republics, North Caucasus, across those regions across the entire North Caucasus, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, et cetera, et cetera. So that does open up that possibility. Very, very low likelihood, well below, we'd say even 10% of the disintegration of the Russian Federation, but it does open up that potential, unfortunately. The next sort of most critical and most disruptive event to watch would be at 15% Russia, NATO going to war. This would be initiated potentially by a mistake, a misreading, a miscommunication, or otherwise an intentional strike by Russia, for example, on supply lines in Poland, on refugee paths leaving Ukraine into Central Europe, or also potential use of a chemical, biological, nuclear, even tactical nuclear weapon within Ukraine. This then would cause NATO intervention into the conflict, and then therefore a direct war with all sorts, of course, of unforeseen developments emanating from that, and of course financial and economic havoc across the entire region. Moving down to the next event at 15%, a drastic drop in Russian oil output. This event, it would be simply a worsening of our base case expectations, where we're already seeing a drop in both oil and gas output in 2023 compared to 2022, therefore a drop in Russia's budget revenues, therefore more pressure on the ruble and the budget spending itself. This would entail even further drops in oil output in particular as a result of the pretty extreme Western sanctions on Russia in terms of Western oil field services firms leaving, that knowledge gone, and then also the imports of the necessary technology to develop and continue production out of existing fields within Russia. And then the last two, least likely, but of course quite significant, Kazakhstan first, then we'll move to Belarus. So in terms of Kazakhstan, this would be basically a a revival of the protests we saw in January of 2022 at the beginning of this year because of continued cost of living issues with rampant inflation that continues that will continue deep into next year. And then also President Tokayev of Kazakhstan effectively unable to consolidate his power amongst the elite base, giving then the potential for protests to escalate, for an elite faction to capitalize upon those protests, and then cause a certain level of instability in Kazakhstan. Similarly, seeing severe instability in Belarus with the potential collapse of the Lukashenko regime. Again, quite unlikely from where we're sitting at today, and would also involve a number of events. Most likely, this would involve a couple of things. In particular, Lukashenko making finally the dangerous decision to enter Belarusian troops into the war in Ukraine, which is highly unpopular within Belarus. And Lukashenko is already walking into this conflict quite unpopular across the country. In addition, he would not be able to rely on the financial and political support and critically, the repressive security services of the Russian Federation to sustain his regime, which likely would occur if Putin himself is under extreme pressure back home and unable to manage the situation in Belarus, which in turn would likely come about as a result of Russia's more losses or even eventual defeat in the war. So a number of risks would have to materialize in order for us to see an actual departure of either Putin or Lukashenko, for that matter, out of Russia or Belarus, respectively. But again, these are the downside, unlikely risk events for 2023, but of course impactful and likely enough that firms should be making contingency plans for them.
Thank you, Mark. That concludes our webinar. And just for more information or detailed walkthrough of some of these events and for other regions as well, please contact your client relationship manager. And if you haven't, take a look at our portal.
Thank you.